Welcome everyone. My name is Megan Carannante and I'm your first speaker this morning. I am the co-chair of the Labor, Employment and Employee Benefits Department at Pullman Comley. We are a full-service law firm with offices throughout Connecticut. We have one in Bridgeport, one in Waterbury, one in Hartford, and then we have a couple other satellite offices. Are you going to be flipping the slides?
I'm going to turn this right over.
Okay. I'm here to talk to you as obviously an employment attorney about some guidance for employers given the legalization of recreational marijuana, what it means for all of you, some concrete tips on some of the issues to look out for, and hopefully some advice that you can take back to your businesses and try and implement to help you deal with this new law, with questions that your employees are going to pose to you, and with the thought that we want to try and keep our workplaces productive and safe, and how we can go about doing that. Obviously, I'm here talking to you about recreational marijuana, but I just wanted to briefly mention some of the other things that I do. In case anybody ever has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I do a lot of employment counseling, so that's counseling employers on how they can navigate various different issues they're facing with their employees, such as discipline issues, any type of issue like that. I also help draft policies, employment policies, both in handbooks and otherwise, on a wide gamut of different things, and can make recommendations to that. Also, we do a lot of training. There's a lot of different topics, sexual harassment, for example, and other types of training, managers training that I do. And I also am a litigator, so I go to state and federal court defending employers in various different disputes. Next, I want to mention our blog. My firm has a blog that we post very frequently on, and it is a great free resource that you can all check out. It's called Working Together, to stay on top of a lot of these different changes. Obviously, we're talking about recreational cannabis today, but it seems every other day we have a new COVID law, which are, they're very hard to make sense of and keep on top of. And so I would strongly recommend that you take a look at our website. We're blogging on all that stuff regularly and giving some concrete advice. Okay, so to the topic at hand. Governor Lamont in July of this year legalized recreational marijuana, as everybody knows. That's for adults 21 years of age or older. In doing that, the state became the 19th state to legalize recreational cannabis. I'm using the term marijuana, but really it's cannabis, and the law encompasses cannabis. Just for purposes of today, I'm saying marijuana, and we could get into that a little bit more later. But I am using the term marijuana just for ease of use. The first question that every employer I talk to asks me is, what does this mean for us? Does this mean we need to now allow our employees to come to work under the influence of cannabis? And the answer is absolutely no. Okay, the law is very clear that it does not require employers to allow their employees to come to work, and that the employers can continue to have drug-free workplace policies, and they can continue to maintain drug-free workplaces. With that said, the law does provide some employment protections for certain types of employees that work in certain types of businesses and certain types of positions. And the idea behind those protections is they're trying to take away the stigma from off-duty cannabis use. And they're trying to say that because it's legal, just like alcohol, that it shouldn't be a reason in certain types of companies and industries to prevent a person from getting a job there, or if they're currently employed, it shouldn't prevent them from, shouldn't cause any problems for them as long as they're doing it off duty. Okay, so these protections that I'm talking about, they go into effect in actually not until next July. So everybody called me and was saying, what do I do? What do I do? Now I need to allow all these protections. And the thing to remember is they don't go into effect till next July. So we have time, but there's certain action steps we should be taking to prepare ourselves for that change. And additionally, because we now have legalized recreational cannabis, we're going to have a lot of questions from our employees about what that means now and what they're allowed to do at work and not at work, and whether they're going to get in trouble. So I want to try and give you some guidance on that today. Okay, so I said there are some protections that apply. These protections do not apply to everyone. When there was a lot of opposition and a lot of different sides that went into this new law, and there's a strong movement by various different types of industries that are safety sensitive and or work with certain types of populations that they wanted to make sure that they were allowed to continue to prohibit off-duty cannabis use. And so there are certain exemptions under this law. It's just two different buckets. So there's certain industries where they do not need to allow any type of off-duty use. They can continue to do exactly what they were doing. They can prohibit off-duty use, and obviously they can continue to prohibit on-duty use. And then there are certain types of positions that are safety sensitive within companies that may not be exempt, and they can also continue to do what they're doing. Even though the law says they can continue to do what they're doing, I'm still recommending, even if you're not technically subject to this law, that you take a look at your policies and you make sure you have clear, updated policies, because it's kind of confusing for your employees, and employees shouldn't be expected to know what rules apply to them. It should be very clear and out there for them so that there's no confusion. So I mentioned the exempted employers. The law itself spells out the different types of employers and the different types of industries that are exempt from the employment protections. And I've got some of them up there, but if you're wondering if your business qualifies as an exempt employer, you just have to take a look at your North American Industry Classification System code, and those codes are listed specifically in the statute. Some examples are healthcare or social services. They're exempt employers: mining, construction, manufacturing. I mentioned there's also exempted positions. So there's certain types of positions that are safety sensitive. These types of positions make sense. Firefighters, EMTs, police officers, law enforcement, employees who might have a CDL license and are subject to DOT regulations. The Department of Transportation has maintained that cannabis is not permitted, and so they would be subject to that, and off-duty use by any person with a CDL license would be violative of the CDL license terms. Any employee who has to complete a course in construction safety per OSHA, employees with defense or Department of Energy security clearance, positions funded by a federal grant. So one of the main issues that comes up is that cannabis remains illegal under federal law. And so for that reason, if a position is funded by federal funds, then that person would be exempt from these protections, because again, that would be violating federal law. Another important exemption is positions that require the supervision of children or vulnerable populations. There's also a catch-all in there for any type of position that the employer decides could adversely impact the health and safety of employees. We're going to have to see how this one plays out and how often employers rely on this, but it is sort of the catch-all provision that is out there and available to employers. And then there's also an exemption for positions at nonprofits, where the whole mission of the nonprofit is to discourage the use of cannabis or another drug, recognizing that that would be an issue. Yeah.
Recreational marijuana.
So there's, we talked about the positions that are exempt. Now I want to turn it over to those who are not exempt. So if you have employees and you're not an exempt employer, or you have some employees that are not exempt positions, you need to think of the protections which are going to go into effect not till July of next year into two different types of buckets. There's the first bucket is a protection in the pre-employment process. So that's if you do pre-employment drug screening. All right, and the rule there is essentially the employer cannot not hire someone or disqualify them from the hiring process based solely on a positive result for cannabis. Okay, and again, the reason behind that is to remove the stigma, to say we're not going to penalize or punish people for engaging in something that's legal prior to coming to work at a company, because the person would have no reason to think that what they're doing could disqualify them from employment. The other bucket is for current employees. So the rule with current employees is we want to make sure we're not having adverse action unless we've provided advance notice to all of our employees that we may take adverse action for off-duty use. So again, we can continue to prohibit any type of on-duty use, but off-duty, if we decide, and a lot of employers don't want to go there, and they want to say, you can do what you want to do on your off-duty time, so long as there's not a safety concern. You can do what you want to do on your off-duty time, just don't come to work under the influence. But if there's other employers that, because of the nature of their work, let's say a car dealership, they're terrified of that. They don't like the idea of off-duty use, and they don't like the idea that potentially someone could come in under the influence of cannabis. And so they start to think about, well, maybe I'm gonna have some drug testing policy. And again, you've got to conform with Connecticut law on that. There's specific laws on when you can conduct drug testing, and it's very particular, and you have to make sure you follow that, or you could have an issue with that. I'm happy to answer questions about that after this or at any other time. But essentially, if you want to regulate off-duty use, you need to provide clear notice of that in a written policy to all of your employees. If you don't provide written notice of that, and then you decide you're going to take adverse action for somebody because you find out they used off-duty, let's say you see a picture of them on Facebook engaging, if you take adverse action and disciplinary action against them or terminate them, you could face a civil lawsuit for that. So I said you could face a civil lawsuit. The civil lawsuit would have to be brought within 90 days. There's a very short turnaround for that. The purpose of that is to make sure that this issue is not sort of just standing out there and an employer wouldn't know for a while. But there is some significant exposure if an employer were to violate these employment protections, potentially facing job reinstatement, back wages, and also reasonable attorney's fees. So the attorney's fees could actually end up being the biggest amount that you would not want to deal with for the plaintiff in that type of lawsuit. So what should you all do now? Because this is obviously what you all want to know. The first thing you want to do is, we talked about exempt employers and exempt positions. You want to take a look at your particular business, and you want to determine if you're an exempt employer and or if you have any exempt positions, because that's going to control sort of how you next approach things. Then you're going to take a minute and you're going to discuss amongst stakeholders what your position is on off-duty cannabis use. Do you want to try and regulate it? Do you want to leave it to your employees to do whatever they want to do on their off-duty time? Do you have particular concerns about safety or productivity at your business that you want to try and build into your approach. You next want to consider what types of drug testing policies that you have and whether or not they need to be revised. So if you have a drug-free workplace, great, but you need to update it. You need to include references to recreational cannabis use. You need to make clear in there that you are prohibiting any work time or on-duty cannabis use. And you want to make clear your position on off-duty use. You also want to take a look at your testing policies. Some employers are informing me that they're deciding to stop testing in their pre-employment process altogether. Others are saying, I want to keep drug testing, but I'm going to remove cannabis from my panel. So those types of discussions. And you want to make sure if you are doing drug testing that you're following all the proper rules for drug testing in Connecticut, that you're giving the appropriate notice and having your prospective employees sign appropriate consents, and you're conducting them in accordance with the law. A lot of employers that I'm talking with are saying, I never had a drug-free workplace policy or a substance and alcohol use policy. What should I do? And I'm saying to them, you need to implement one, because a lot of the companies I speak with, they say, oh, we're a small company, we're family run, we've never had to implement policies. And my advice for them always is that the norms and rules on that are changing. And it is standard policy and procedure now that every company, no matter how small, have concrete policies. And you know, if you go to an unemployment proceeding or you have a discrimination complaint filed against you or a wage claim, most likely the government entity is going to ask for copies of your policies. So you want to make sure that you have those in place. Also, there's an expectation among our workers today that you're going to have clear written policies. There's a move obviously towards transparency and making sure that expectations are articulated. You also want to train your managers, because your managers are your front line and they're the ones that are going to be dealing with these issues. So you want to make them aware of the fact that there is this new law out there, that there are some protections that are coming into effect. And you want to train them on signs of impairment, because they're different, and hopefully we'll talk about that later in the presentation. That's sort of beyond me. My final slide has to do with what to include in a drug-free workplace policy, because we often get that question. The first thing you want to do in there is you want to explain why you're implementing the policy, the purpose of the policy. You also want to, as I said, you want to describe the rules and expectations regarding both drug and alcohol use and testing, so that it's clear for everybody. You want to be specific about what is prohibited and what is allowed, where and when. You also want to provide guidance on signs of impairment. You want to outline the types of drug and alcohol testing that you're going to conduct at your business. Another important thing is you want to provide information on assistance, because obviously there is a danger of, with drug use and alcohol use, there is a danger of overindulging, and you want to make sure that you articulate to your employees that you are supportive of anyone struggling with drug or alcohol use or dependency, and that you have resources you can help connect them with to deal with those issues. You also want to make sure there's clear contact information about who to ask questions if anyone has questions about your drug and alcohol and drug-free workplace policy. And perhaps most importantly, you want to clearly articulate the consequences of violating the policy. And that ties back again to the law, as we talked about at the beginning, which is just making sure that everybody at your organization has knowledge and information about what's allowed and what's not, and what happens to them or could potentially happen to them from a disciplinary standpoint if they don't comply. Thank you.
Does anybody, I'm going to open it up while I make the switch to the next slideshow. If anybody has any quick questions for Megan.
I do have a question regarding the codes that, the employer code.
Yes.
Is there a list that people can cross-reference? Because I'm sure we're part of that. I just need to make sure. So-
Yeah, there's if you probably just, if you Google, I always forget the acronyms.
It's the code.
Yeah,
So I just.
do you know
wanna make
your
sure.
code? Do you know?
Not
your-
offhand, I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, but if you, I can send you, if you give me your information, I can send you, the piece of the statute, or I can even copy piece of the statute that lists the codes, and then you can just match.
Oh, okay, because I'm sure we're in there, but I just gotta make sure. Good.
But again, for you, you want to make sure that you just have clear policy that says,
I mean, we already have something existing, it's just what's new.
right, so you would want to specifically reference, recreational cannabis. You could also want to, the other thing we're sort of recommending is that you would say that if you're an exempt employer, you say we're an exempt employer, we're not subject to providing these protections.
Okay.
So that it's clear
Yeah. I think that would make sense.
in your policy. And a good reminder to everybody that you know that recreational cannabis use is now legal in the state of Connecticut. However, because you're an exempt employer, given the nature of the services you provide, that.
And we reference the statute.
Yeah. Because not everyone would just assume that.
I was gonna say, I bet you most employees have no idea.
They have no idea all this is.
They just know, oh, it's legal, and, think that they're not doing anything wrong or harmful to their job or anything too, and all of a sudden they end up in a world of,
Pain,
yeah.
I was gonna say hurt.
Good choice.
which they're probably trying to avoid the pain of living in.
Yeah, it's,